My name is Jennifer Wang, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in New York State. I'm also first generation, half Korean, half Egyptian.
Okay, Jen, I'm so glad that you're here for this conversation, honestly. I've been really looking forward to this. Something that I really believe is that understanding culture and mental health go hand in hand. So, having these conversations about race, mixed race, and then even more nuanced, mixed Asian, and that can be broken down in so many layers as well. But today, specifically, we wanted to discuss exploring not feeling Korean enough. What does that even mean? How can we break that down? How do we overcome that feeling? And then, even further, how to practice self love and self acceptance. On our channel, we get a lot of disheartening comments from people who say, like, I will never love myself because I'm mixed. And to have this self-hatred connected to something that you can't change about yourself,
Yeah.
it's very sad to see that. So we're hoping that people who maybe feel that way, even just quietly and not sharing it with the outside world, will find a lot of good that comes from this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about like within my household, again, emotional expression was so limited, if not really apparent, right? So there's a lot of internalization and suppression. And so I just think about then how that's going to impact on an individual level. And then as we become adults, if I'm thinking of a family systemic brain, because I'm the family therapist, I think about how that impacts then our relationships with people and how we do relationships because of the internalized feelings.
So do you think that this is important to talk about mixed race and race in an open manner?
I absolutely do. I think it's really important to have it feel like a safe space and have a conversation. I think, people can feel a little obviously uncomfortable and maybe not really sure how to go about it. And so I think people might tend to just not have the conversation. Ideally, it could be a conversation facilitated by the parent or caregivers, or even if the children, the mixed kids, come home and they have questions, like being curious and just having an open, candid conversation.
My mom has her own set of experiences and her own set of ideas how you should talk about race, how you should talk about yourself as an individual. And then my dad had his own ideas and his own upbringings. And when you're, somewhere in between and you've got this question that's like, how do I talk to my dad about these racist remarks that white people specifically are saying against me? But then how do I talk to my mom about this as well? So in this case, who should be basically leading this conversation when it comes to mixed race identity? Does it start in the home? Is it the parents' responsibility, even if they haven't experienced those same things? Or should this be part of the school education?
I think it can be a combo of things. I would say starting within the home, and I think, that definitely does fall onto the parent or the caregivers. I'm the expert in knowing what it's like to be mixed, so I might share what I know, to educate and support my children. My partner, who is white, he might share what he knows in the sense from his perspective. So I think with the parents, to be a collaborative approach, and that might be a conversation the two might have to have elsewhere prior to engaging with their children. And I also think, like for me, I learned a lot from peers, and then I had to kind of navigate that way, and that made it a little bit tougher. I had to do that on my own, and so I can imagine a lot of other mixed half Koreans probably do the same. They might not feel comfortable bringing this to their parent or caregivers.
If you're growing up with one Asian parent, especially if it's a man like your dad, this expression of emotion might even be considered weakness, or you don't want to burden your parents, or they're kind of not understanding. There might be a disconnect between generations, and it can be really hard to find somebody to talk to, or you start to ask more of these questions of identity based on what your friends are saying, based on what you're seeing at school, because this is where you're spending a lot of your time. But I feel like in Korea, especially, the schools play a huge role in how these mixed kids, are going to feel belonging in the Korean society.
And I think I shared this with you on Zoom before, like filling out the little, census in middle school, elementary school. I didn't know. I would just pick random things one day. And I was totally that kid. The teacher would be like, Jen, like you put this. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, last week you put that. I was like, oh, And I wasn't able to have those conversations with my dad. And, I think for in my situation was just a little bit more unique because my dad is an immigrant. I'm sure if I spoke Korean, I really wonder if we would be able to have a little bit more of that conversation candidly. I think because of that, it's tougher to navigate. Kind of becomes like you're forging your own path in a way. So then I think it's being able to have a support system that can be there for you in navigating that, whether it's peers, siblings, extended family, even. A lot of my clients I have are Asian American, if not full or half. And so we have this conversation a lot and talk so much about our family dynamics and how that's really, impacted them. And I think I say that because I want to highlight, like, it's not all negative. There's definitely some really good takeaways in also being, I think, mixed.
I admit that at first it was kind of hard to think like, what is the positive thing? Am I putting a spin? Is this fake? Am I being sincere about really loving about being mixed race? But the more and more you understand, the more and more you learn. I personally think that ultimately it is a huge blessing, and there are so many wonderful things, and this is what we really want to also talk about and maybe reveal to some people today. People advocate, I'm full Korean and I'm also full Egyptian. I'm full Korean and I'm full Bolivian. I mean, it's hard to be 100% of two separate things. It feels a little bit mutually exclusive. So inevitably, this feeling of not feeling Korean might happen, but it can seem a bit vague. Where do you think this is coming from, this feeling like I'm just not Korean enough?
I think it can start within the home, not even in an intentional way. It can be from physical, emotional, and mental. So physical can be the traits, right? It could be skin, eyes, hair, and face, Then I think around like mental values and beliefs of what you're being taught within the household and maybe what you might struggle to accept. Like I think around in, Korean households, gender roles is a really big one. And I remember for me personally, I definitely tried to rebel against that because I was like, no, equality, pops. And he would just be like, no, Korean women are going to do this. And I was like, I refuse it, So I think it starts in the home. And then from there, when we are now in middle school, elementary school, high school, then you're seeing your peers. And then you might see some Korean peers that are congregated together. And then that can start the piece of not feeling sure of, can I talk with them? And maybe you try, then those interactions go. And I think in those interactions, it starts to develop a core belief around you're not Korean enough, AKA you're not good enough. And then that just continues to build, I think, as we get into adulthood. And so for some people, it might be, well, then I'm just going to denounce that part of me and just really not be close to it. But what I find in that, and I can share from my own personal experience, as I got older, I felt like there was a piece of me that was still missing. And a large part of that was for me not healing from all of those interactions and those messages that I internalized as not feeling Korean enough, that I needed to really work on healing. And I'm not 100% there, but I've definitely been starting to notice that. And when I did that, I felt more complete as a person, not even thinking so much as I'm Korean enough. I just felt in general like I'm good enough.
Do you think it's really common for people who are mixed Korean, mixed race, to feel unable to fit in one side or the other? Or do you think this is cliche? Because we will get, especially from Korean commenters, like, why do you even talk about mixed race? Why do you even call yourself Hunyo? You're full Korean. Like, I don't understand. Or you're just white. So why do you even have this discussion? It's easy. Just accept it. And so this is kind of the question I want to pose to you. Do you think it's just, are we making something up? Is this cliche?
If we were to get really deep in this, I think as mixed Koreans, we all want a sense, actually anyone in general, we all want a sense of feeling belonging and seen. And I think when people dismiss that part for us, then we feel further like we're not being seen or heard. When I talked about some of the physical traits, it can be when I went to Korea, my family in Korea said I looked a lot like my mom. And so much of that was my skin because I'm darker than they are, And so it could be these subtle kind of comments, but in the other hand, they were, holding my hand with my little aunt and we were really close. And so there's still these really nice embraces. So I felt very much accepted, even though in their mind, I don't think I'm 100% Korean. And I think as mixed race, especially with mixed Koreans, it does feel like you have to almost choose because it's hard to do both to be 100% invested in both. Unless, my parents taught us both Arabic and Korean, then that would have been sweet, but they did not. So, it seemed like one culture overseated another.
How do you overcome this dissonance that I think a lot of bicultural people feel? Maybe on one hand, you're feeling really like, oh, I'm Korean, I'm so close to, let's say, my mom. I eat Korean food all the time. She speaks to me in Korean. You have this feeling inside you like, I'm Korean, I'm accepted as Korean. Then when you step outside of that safe zone and the whole world, or even people who are fellow Koreans are pointing fingers at you, saying, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not. How do you deal with that dissonance that's happening?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. So I think about how then it's all about being able to differentiate from people. Mm-hmm. And when I say differentiating, it's essentially having an invisible protective bubble of being grounded in you, you know who you are, mm-hmm. despite what other people might say or do. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to do. It's a daily practice. But I think when you're able to be in this way, like I talk about, when you're able to get to the place of self-love and self-acceptance of you are good enough, you are Korean enough, whatever that looks like for you, your relationships with people will start to shift, and some good, some bad, because you're being more grounded in you. And so it's really important to kind of hold on to that little invisible bubble barrier you have of like, no, like I know who I am, despite what you see outside. And again, it's tough to do, because I say that to myself, and then I'll go into the Korean market and I'll always like say hello in Korean, and then they look at me always strange, but I'm like, but I said hello and I still got it, kind of. And that's my win for the day.
It's pretty tough, I think, for people who might be feeling alone in this, because a lot of it is telling yourself this. If you're not getting this validation from your society or from your community or even from your own family, it can be really hard to bolster yourself up in that way. So you had mentioned these practices, these daily practices. I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I talk about self-love, and like I do this a lot even in my private practice and my work, and I think it can be varies steps, in the sense of like, I think so much around, again, language, mm-hmm. how you talk to yourself, noticing the thoughts that come into your mind when you're starting to have a moment, whether you have an interaction or you kind of get triggered by, maybe you see Korean soap opera, or that's like the rave right now, right? Being able to have that self-awareness of stopping that kind of thought, and maybe framing it differently around just maybe appreciating what it is, or like, maybe I'll learn a word today. So it's really about shifting that narrative internally that you have, mm-hmm. of being more compassionate to yourself. Because I think there's a sense of expectation of pressure. And when you add the part around too, like the fetishization, I think is so apparent for Asian women. Mm-hmm. So then you have a half Korean woman, like the pretty enough, that's literally like the message I got externally as well as internally growing up, was that I'm pretty enough, so I'm gonna make it far because I'm mixed. When you get older, you internalize that of like, cool, so this is all I am as a face. Mm-hmm. And then you don't get to do that inner work around that self-confidence, and like, there's so much more to you than this appearance. And like, I feel like that feels really like, let's pick at that, but wait, like, we'll disregard these other parts. Mm-hmm. It's not taking the good and the bad and the work in progress. It's like, oh, we'll just highlight those things of, mixed kid's pretty, and that can feel dismissive.
The concept of beauty changes throughout history, throughout the culture, whatever context that you're in. So you might mm-hmm. find yourself in the States alienized and kind of like, oh, you look so weird. And then you'll come to, some other country and people are like, oh my gosh, you're the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen. And I just think it's really important to recognize that that's relative. Standards of beauty is relative.
Absolutely. So in regards, again, to that self-love of like the language, I even have like, I would say even being able to practice like positive affirmations, like making Post-its, like I have Post-its here, and putting it around places that are visible, whether it's your mirror or not, to again, start to practice. And I know it might sound really like silly for people. It can really do something when you start to see that externally. Eventually that starts to change a narrative internally, So I think it's a co-created of being cognizant of yourself and the language and thoughts you go to when you want to go to that place of not feeling Korean enough, and really shaming yourself, to showing yourself compassion and love of like, there is no guidebook to be Korean enough or be mixed race enough or whatnot. It's honestly, if you accept yourself, then that's all that matters, really. And I think that energy plays out into your relationships.
Do you think it's possible for everyone?
I think so. Absolutely. We are really constantly evolving and changing and like a work in progress. And so I think this is something that's a overshadow of that continued work on self. And that's that self-love and self-compassion. And we can focus on other people and externalize that all we want. But I think it really comes down to self, because that's what I can control. I can't control my Korean family and accepting me. I can just accept me, and then we'll engage however that looks. That's putting a sense of control in other people when we don't have that. And ironically, then we feel out of control because we are. Like, we're putting our expectations and pressure on those people. That's not their job. It's really our job to do that for ourselves. I think practicing positive affirmation, so creating visuals, whether it is making Post-its, putting like memos on your phone, meditations can be really helpful in that. I think by doing that, you're being able to start focusing on yourself and building up that self-esteem. Even though it could feel kind of awkward, it's practicing your language, shifting your narrative around yourself of more self-compassion versus shame and totally blaming and being negative when it comes to not feeling Korean enough. And then the other part is finding ways to heal, like knowing where that's coming from for you. Because sometimes we can trace it to maybe there's a specific moment in your life, or it can just be a series of things. Work towards healing that. And that might be, maybe you start to read more about Korean culture, or maybe you can try to have conversations with family. It can look different for everyone. I think that's the biggest one. And I think that can take some time.
That's something we want to extra emphasize to the people who are part of this community, is that it's okay to feel a little bit out of your element, when you're starting this journey, and it can feel uncomfortable and kind of lonely, to be honest. But there are a lot of people who go through that journey. There's a lot of people who feel those same things and haven't spoken it out. But it's important to let these people know that you are seen. And
Absolutely.
Your journey will look different. It's going to be personal, and it's going to take a long time. And that's okay.
Yeah. And I think by you even wanting to start the journey, even listening to this interview, I think already shows how brave you are in doing this. And I think that's something to hold on to, like being so brave and so resilient in wanting to navigate this piece around self-love and acceptance of being half Korean. That's, that's powerful. There's a lot of, I think we all have an inner strength that we just kind of get buried away. So it's really just tapping into that.
You're very well spoken, honestly.
Great, because my pits are sweating. So
I'm still recording this.